Hi, this is me, Josh Goldberg, with From Takedown to TypeScript for CascadiaJS. Whoop. Let's get started with a little bit of intro about me. First, hi, I work at Codecademy as a staff front-end developer. I'm on our web platform team, which means I work on the shared tooling across all of our front-end apps, things like React and Webpack and Next.js. I'm also writing an O'Reilly book on TypeScript, which I'll have a link to for an early access preview at the end of the presentation. And on the side, TypeScript is my thing, and open source in general. And I'm excited to be here. If you'd like to connect with me, see more, I don't know why you would, but my Twitter handle is Joshua K. Goldberg, and my website is joshuakgoldberg.com. The actual talk today is going to be a few things, somewhat haphazardly strung together. First, we'll talk about beauty of the web. I think the web is cool. We're going to talk about how you can treat developers as users, how that can be done particularly effectively with TypeScript, and then linking it all together, we're going to talk about some barriers to entry in all three of those sections. And that topic, barrier to entry, is going to be coming up quite a lot in this presentation, so let's define it. A barrier to entry is a force making it harder for someone to do something. In economic theory, it's something that's making it more difficult for a company to enter a market, such as not having a factory or expertise in the market. For developers, for users, it might be something that makes it hard to get started, or something that makes it hard to set up software locally. And I want you to think through this presentation about all the different stuff I'm saying and how that relates to barriers to entry. How does this increase or decrease? How does this create or tear down barriers to entry for any particular area? I think it's an interesting framing. So let's start, for real. Beauty of the web. If you ignore all the horrible, dehumanizing, terrible things that have been particularly relevant the last few years, the actual concept of a modern internet and web browser is pretty nifty. To recap, before the modern HTML5 web, if you wanted to download software on the internet, let alone go to some physical location and buy it, God forbid, you would first have to request the software from some potentially shady website. Your server from that website would then send you a download of that software. You'd have to install the software locally. And then once all that is done, assuming you trusted the software in the first place, you have to run the software on your computer finally to get whatever complicated thing happening. That's a lot. Nowadays, an HTML5 website, it's much simpler. You open your browser, you visit a URL, the server for that URL sends back some assets, images, CSS, JavaScript, and then all of a sudden you're running the HTML web page on your computer. Much better, much cleaner, very speedy. And as an example of a website that I did adhering to that speediness, I made a thing back in 2013 called Full Screen Mario. I was very proud of it. It was a browser game that was a remake of the original Super Mario Brothers. It had the original 32 levels. It had a random map generator, a level editor. It was pretty cool. Mods, API that you could program in JavaScript. Unfortunately, it was taken down by Nintendo, so this URL no longer works. Sorry. Haha. A little bit of details. It was my first big JavaScript project. I had never done a big JS thing before. I built it in my spare time over a year. I decided it would be fun and educational to use a custom written integrated game engine for it instead of something popular like Phaser. Late in the game, I realized that's a terrible idea. It was very slow, and I had to refactor to use HTML5 canvas APIs instead of moving around DOM rectangles on the screen. And it was structured before modern modules, or I understood bundlers at the time, such as Browserify. So, putting it nicely, it was absolutely terrible code. Without a doubt, the worst code that I have ever written. But it was nifty seeing a lot of people use it for something like a month or two of popularity before it got shut down. And I want to bring back the concept of barrier to entry here, because this thing was an immediate win for many people. You open the page and immediately you see full screen Mario, which is to you just Mario, the thing that you had when you were a kid, which for a lot of people, myself included, brought back family nostalgia of opening a Game Boy or NES or whatnot as a present, or a Nintendo DS for the younger folks. It made you feel like when you had a happy supporting life, maybe, or not, and whatever it was, you enjoyed it better with video games. For me, I had no friends, so I was always playing on my purple Game Boy Color, which had Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. And that was such a key driver that as soon as you went to this page, there was no barrier to entry beyond knowing how to use WASD or arrows on your keyboard. It was fun. It was wholesome. And that brings us to our first truth of this presentation. The sooner a user starts the main part of your application, the sooner they can emotionally bond with it. As soon as that da-da-da-da-da-da played, people felt something with FSM. And to contrast, let's look at a typical news website in today's era, which starts loading. Notice how it's still loading. The screen resizes for ads. A popover appears on the bottom. The page is still loading, and about 10% of the screen real estate is dedicated to the actual content of the website. That is crap. Poor user experiences are a serious barrier to entry, especially for those with low technical competence. If you don't feel comfortable using a computer, if you're new to it, if you're not particularly proficient with the internet, if you're not sure what it means to use a browser or surf the web or whatever these fancy terms are, it can be very discouraging, very unsettling, off-putting to have this confusing website throw a bunch of stuff in your face. So it's very important for user experiences that you remove common barriers to entry for your users. So I'm calling on you as the audience, whether you're a product engineer or a designer or bored and not relating to anything I'm saying, please don't shift or cover real page content with ads. That makes people less likely to use your website and therefore click your ads. And instead, hone your first run experience for simplicity, for an aha moment. If you're a news site, you want to have a big fun headline like a real newspaper, not a giant ad catch people's eyes. If you're a game, make people feel a connection to the game with a trailer or a demo or nice screenshots or something, a description. You want to prioritize pleasing your users, making them feel that you have a good product, that they want to pay for it, before you start bilking them for money. This is something we learned a lot at Codecademy. You can have all the pro subscription advertisements in the world explaining all the great benefits, but until someone feels like the free product itself is alone worth spending time on, they're not going to pay for jack squat. Barriers to entry are bad. Who would have thought? And I want to talk about a special subclass of users now. A very, very irate, angry group, developers. Because when you're trying to get a developer to use a project, whether it's a website that they might browse or an actual coding library, you need to understand how to adhere to their user journey, how to remove barriers to entry for them as well. Developers go through a somewhat vaguely reminiscent user journey, a user story, to real users. They discover your whatever it is. They prepare, they consider whether they want to get it locally, they maybe clone it, and then they contribute to it, hopefully, give or take. And I want to go through each of those three actions a developer might take with your project. Let's say it's some library, because each of them are very key for making sure that someone wants to and is able to use or contribute to your project. When someone first discovers you, they're asking, do I want to contribute to or use this? Can I contribute to or use this? Is it worth my time? Is it already good enough? Will I have a good experience? So you want to do a few key actions to make it seem reasonable to them. Set up clear, concise explanations in the documentation. Create some kind of quick, hopefully one-click demo showing your basic features. And by doing these two things, you can make it very clear and understandable what it is your project does, that you care about the documentation, and how one can test it out for themselves. This is all good stuff. Once someone has hopefully become at least a little interested, hopefully convinced, of your project, you want to make it easy for them to set it up locally. Document clear and hopefully concise local setup instructions, yarn installs, makefiles, whatever it is. And once they've got it built, make sure there's a good way to quickly and reliably test local changes. The console.log hello world method should work for someone pretty quickly if they want to open up a DevTool terminal or something. Once they've got that feedback cycle locally, they might want to contribute, again, hopefully. So you probably want to include some kind of unit tests, some general testing instructions, so that they have confidence that their changes aren't disastrous for the rest of the app. You probably want to create templates for issues and pull requests, and hopefully you're active on GitHub or Jira or whatever project it is. And although I want to frame these in the context of open source, because there are a lot of benefits of open source that I'll get into, this is true for all software projects that have multiple people working on it. You want to have unit tests if you got other people working, because otherwise there's no easy automated way to know whether they've broken basic functionality other than them already having known that functionality. And that's hard to ask. If there's no setup instructions and you're on a team, how is someone supposed to onboard? Are they just going to ask someone else on the team for everything? A lot of people aren't comfortable with that. That's a big barrier to entry for joining a team and feeling like a productive member. You should be willing and able to help them, but ideally the setup should be simple and understandable enough that your team members can go through it and feel confidence on their own as well. But specifically open sourcing, I'm a big fan because opening a project up, letting people on the internet see and hopefully contribute to it has a lot of benefits. It removes barriers to entry for sharing your code. If it's all out there, it's almost implicitly shared. Receiving contributions from people in or out of your team becomes a lot easier. And it's much more fun and easy to gain recognition for your project if it's out there in the open. Using Full Screen Mario as an example, I did eventually make a game engine out of it called 8bitter. All the modules in 8bitter, which I'll show in a couple slides, have names that are this silly 2-word, ends with an R version. I want to say at the time it was a parody of popular JavaScript libraries, always doing that. I don't remember. It's not a good game engine. I would not recommend using it, but it is fun. It's also being used to power a few other games, most notably Full Screen Pokemon, which I've been working on for a while, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's Full Screen Mario, but Pokemon. And please don't share this too much, because every time I talk about my projects in a major way, Nintendo sends me a DMCA notice, which is really annoying. Please don't. Anyway, 8bitter, and I'm not going to quiz you on this slide, is a full game engine. It's very composable, very modular. I was able to do this because it's open source, and I was working with various other people over the years. Each of its modules is dedicated to a single purpose. For example, the map spawning area of modules keeps track of what maps have been spawned, the objects that could spawn, where they are on the screen. There's collision detection, events handling, graphics, my face is over this, but interactions, miscellaneous utilities. And the fun part of it is, if you look at the dependency graph for the major modules, it's a little convoluted. It works horrifyingly, but it's working. And this brings us to another truth. If you do want to open your project up, if you want to get other people working on it, whether it's open source or internal, the larger your project is, the more useful and the more it needs thorough documentation. And there are a few ways that documentation can exist for your project. You can do something as simple as a README, just explaining the basics, maybe having a few examples. You could have full usage examples, which takes a little more time, but is very effective in showing how to use the thing. I really hope if you got a big project, there's some kind of testing, maybe unit tests. And 8bitter has this. I found it to be very useful. Guided walkthroughs for onboarding people. And again, if the goal of your project is to open it up, to get more people to be able to participate with you, I cannot recommend enough doing all 4 of these things, if not more, to make it an understandable project. But there's one thing from the title of this talk that I think is not maybe a newer form of documentation, but one of the most effective things you can do to document your code. And that's TypeScript. Yay, TypeScript. Definitionally, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that adds syntax to declare types, along with a type checker and services to verify and use that type information. What on earth does that mean? If you haven't used it yet, you have, in this slide, input TypeScript on the left and output JavaScript on the right. They're very similar. The only real difference here is that in TypeScript, we have the ability to annotate that something, in this case a parameter, is a particular type. String. The real juice comes in from when TypeScript is able to use that information, the type checker, to check whether stuff you're doing matches up. If we add a piece of code that calls this a function with a number instead of that string, TypeScript can yell at us saying, hey, you messed up. That argument of type number is not assignable to the parameter of type string. And if you see that error message enough, you can become one of the few people who remembers what the difference between argument and parameter is, because otherwise, how and why would you? And this is great. This is a removal of many barriers to entry, a reduction of them, because it documents and enforces your project structures. I should recognize that TypeScript is itself a barrier to entry. We'll go into this a little bit at the end of the presentation. You have to learn it. But once you overcome that initial barrier, it opens up a lot of doors for being able to understand and use the project effectively. Taking a rough example from the full screen Mario source code, if you, let's say, wanted to add an event in the game that happens in some amount of time to, say, console log an emoji, you might write this after looking through the source code and seeing that there's some FSM objects and some time handler API. Heaven only knows what they do. But with TypeScript, we can declare things like interfaces that say that, let's say there's an add event method on the time handler, which takes in a callback, optional delay, and using that, TypeScript would then be able to say, no, you silly goose, you're doing it wrong. Use the add event API, which would then let you correct your code. And it's stuff like this. TypeScript telling us exactly what is allowed and what isn't that lets us build these really big, scaled, complex web applications using TypeScript. This is a very small subset of the 8-bitter source code, just the 8-bitter class itself. I know no one likes classes anymore, I'm sorry, but for game engines, they can be useful. There is a lot more here to justify it being a class, but that's another presentation. For now, we're just going to look at one method, create area spawner. We're not going to look at how these get called, just I promise you there is infrastructure so that when someone wants to get the area spawner method, or member rather, of the 8-bitter, we call this create area spawner function, which takes in an area, pardon me, an 8-bitter game, it's hard to say these things, and returns a new area spawner instance. And this new area spawner instance has a whole bunch of methods on it, a whole bunch of things that get added in the constructor, optional overrides, and all this stuff, there's no human being that could reasonably want to understand and memorize all of it in their head. This is why TypeScript is great, because you have complex things that get scaled no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to keep it simple, and without TypeScript, it's a lot harder to keep track of them. And with that, I'd like to move on to our last topic, barriers to entry itself. How are you making it harder for users to engage? As you scale your project, you will inevitably be adding barriers to entry. The bigger the project complexity, the more barriers to entry you have. That's just how projects go. It is the way of the world. The bigger the project, the more stuff in it, and the more things you have to learn. So let's take a look at two packaged JSON snippets. On the left, it's what 8-bitter started as, give or take. And on the right, it's what it is now, give or take. And which one would you prefer? Looking at that giant glut on the right. Now, some of you might be saying, obviously I want the one on the left because that's simpler, it's easy. And some of you are saying, look at all the cool stuff on the right. We have, I'm just looking through Mocha and TypeScript, I think. Yeah, and Webpack. And honestly, sometimes one is better, sometimes not. It depends. There's no single answer of, do I want my complexity? Sometimes what you want is something simple and clean, and sometimes what you want is a lot more features. So a lot of the times in web dev space, a lot of us are just going in and wanting the features, adding things willy-nilly. But I really want us to caution ourselves. When we're adding something to a project, we want to ask ourselves, we should ask ourselves, how am I creating barriers to entry for others? Am I creating complicated architectures without documenting them? Am I, say, maybe making this huge class structure and not explaining what it is? Am I creating a custom game engine without any documentation? Or using the examples from before, am I using tools such as TypeScript? If not, is it going to be harder to interact with my code base? Throwing a curveball example in there, does your team give interviews to people that basically require a 4-year CS degree? If someone doesn't know how to reverse a singly linked list, or run a depth first traversal in a graph, or whatever fun algorithm Z concept, is that going to exclude them from your day-to-day work? Should it? So we should think about that a little bit. One more question for you before we recap. I want to ask you to think a little bit also, what barriers to entry are impacting you? And how can you beat them? Now, personally, I'll give you an example. I wrote Full Screen Mario at a time very early in my career when I seriously doubted that I was going to be a successful programmer. I just didn't think it was going to happen. I was in school. I was struggling in my coursework. Everyone around me was seeming to do great. For the weekly projects, they were finishing 3 days before the deadline. I was barely getting it done before midnight. And I felt what at the time was the new concept of imposter syndrome to many. And I just wanted to be able to prove to myself, yes, I can do this programming thing. Full Screen Mario helped me a lot in my career, in my life. It helped me gain confidence. It gave me a lot of valuable experience. And maybe something like that would be useful for you. Maybe it would be a giant waste of time. You have to decide for yourself. TypeScript 2. Scaling Full Screen Mario and 8-bitter now to TypeScript was very helpful for me for learning TypeScript. So what barriers to entry are impacting you? And how can you beat them? Anyway, let's recap. What have we talked about today? First, we talked about the beauty of the web, how getting things to people quickly is fun and can make good things. We talked about developers as users, how they also want things to work quickly for them, and how we can appeal to and attract them. Open source, yay! We talked about how you can scale things with TypeScript, how TypeScript's a fantastic form of documentation and helps reduce barriers to entry. And we talked about some common tech barriers to entry, such as TypeScript or not using TypeScript. What a conundrum. Lastly, I have a few resources for you. If you're curious about 8-bitter, if you want to see how I document my code, write unit tests, and all that, it is a mono repo on GitHub, fullscreenshenanigans/8-bitter. If you're curious about how Full Screen Mario worked back in the day, I did write a quick little blog post for Gamma Sutra, a gaming blog about how it works. Recommend checking it out if you want that type of 2013, barely in college information. TypeScript itself has excellent documentation on the TypeScript website. Cannot recommend that website enough for docs. And if you want to go through a very early version of my Learning TypeScript book, the URL is here. That's all from me. If you'd like to contact me, I'm on Twitter at Joshua K. Goldberg and on the internet at joshuakgoldberg.com. Thank you very much to the Cascadia organizers for setting this up. This is one of the most inclusive, well-done conference organizations I have ever seen, and I really appreciate you folks powering through it. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye!
And we're back. And I'm talking here with Josh. Thank you so much for that presentation, Josh. I think I actually played Full Screen Mario before it got taken down, so cool.
Awesome.
So you talked about barriers to entry. I want to know, are there times when barriers to entry can be beneficial?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. Not all the time do we have the resources or the bandwidth to deal with all the things we want to deal. So on GitHub, for example, if you have an issue template or a pull request template that makes people go through the process of setting up a reproduction, maybe making a code sandbox, that's a barrier to entry. I think that's a good thing. That stops people from spamming you or giving you low quality stuff. So although I personally tend to have a negative skew when I think of barriers to entry, there are times when you do want people to slow down and think a little bit more before approaching you, for sure.
So that would be adding complexity. And you did call out complexity as a barrier to entry. So how can you tell whether, something like TypeScript or something else that you're adding that adds complexity are worth it?
I don't know that there's ever going to be a hard yes or no algorithm there. As a soft answer, I would say you should check whether you feel you're getting more benefit than pain from a tool. If you're using TypeScript on a project that's 2 files, 100 lines total, maybe it's not quite worth it. But for some people, it might be a different answer than you. For some people, they might have a really hard time with the tools you're using on a project that make you much more productive. So I don't know that there's ever going to be a hard answer to that.
All right. Well, it depends.
It always depends.
And so the last question, we got a minute left here. What would you say to someone who's thinking of getting involved with open sourcing their code or jumping in on an open source project, but isn't really at home with it yet?
I'd say you're not alone. I think a lot of people struggle with whether they want to open source stuff. The biggest pain point I've seen is that a lot of folks aren't willing to put what they've done on the internet. They don't want people to see the terrible code they wrote at 2 a.m. And that's normal, but you should just put it up there anyway. Just open source your stuff. You don't have to share it. You don't have to participate with other people, but get yourself comfortable by dipping your toe in the water. And then maybe once you start using tools a little more like GitHub and you feel a little more comfortable, maybe you can start posting issues or even sending a pull request or two to other repositories. Definitely recommend taking it easy if you're not super comfortable and easing yourself into there. It's a great place to be.
So start by coding in the open.
Coding in the open. I think the phrase learn in public has been bounced around a lot recently, so I definitely +1 that.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Josh. And now we're going to hand over the stage to Kyle Shevlin, who will tell us about using React hooks sensibly.